Hi Paolo, this is Grandmaster Eugene Perelshteyn for AskGM.com, and I will be analyzing your game today. So let's take a look. You're playing black and your opponent decides to play the Alpine Sicilian or the C3 Sicilian. Normally, I would recommend to play G6 because the main lines, while they're totally playable, D5 and Knight f6 have too much theory, and your opponent is probably well prepared. So I really love the move G6, and the idea is that whenever white plays D4, here he plays Knight f3, but whenever white plays D4, you want to take that pawn and immediately hit him with D5. And this is basically the theme of this game. After E5, bishop G7, the knight may go to F3, and after bishop G4, it will be the transposition. So let's get back to the game. So he plays knight F3, bishop G7, and now D4. It's very important to remember that if your opponent plays bishop C4 first, this is a very tricky move. Notice that the bishop and the pawn take away the D5 square. In this case, you have to play E6, and after D4 takes to hit the bishop with D5 with excellent counterplay for black. So let's get back to the game. After knight F3, bishop G7, D4 takes, D5 is an excellent move. E5 is the main line. I should also mention that after E takes D, it's very important to play knight F6 and not be afraid of this check. After knight BD7, white can castle, and if you castle and play knight B6, you're easily going to win the D pawn, or white can play D6. In this case, this endgame is absolutely fine for black. You later play knight B6, fight for the D5 square, the bishop can be developed to E6, you can play H6, kick the bishop out, king can go to D7, super easy play for black. So let's get back to the main line. He plays E5, bishop G4, bishop B5 check. Now this is very important, and you correctly reacted with the move knight to D7. Knight C6 is the main line, but I like it less because it gives white the option in the future to take on C6 and ruin your pawn structure. So this is the reason why I want to try to avoid this. So knight D7 is the right move. He plays knight BD2 with the idea to play H3, and after bishop takes to recapture with the knight, which makes sense. So you play E6, logical move, castles, and now I really like your move A6. It's good idea to ask the bishop his intention. If he takes on D7, after queen takes, H3, bishop takes, knight takes, black has already equalized. You have no bad bishop. The pawns are on the light squares, and this is very important to remember. When the bishops are of the same color, you want the pawns on the opposite color of the bishop, whereas his pawns are on the dark squares. Knight here is the typical idea. Bishop can go to F4 or E3, and now you have an option, knight F5 or knight C6, castle with very easy game. So he plays bishop to D3. Notice that he doesn't want to give up the bishop for the knight, and now knight E7 is the right reply. Here he plays knight B3. It's a good question to ask, what would you play after the move H3? Very good question. So two possibilities. One idea is to simply take, knight takes, castle, and for instance bishop here, then knight to C6, followed by F6 and queen B6 ideas. The drawback of this plan is obvious that he does have the bishop pair. But on the other hand, black gets typical counterplay. Once you play for F6, pawn takes, you get to take with the bishop, the knight, and the queen will put tons of pressure. Later on, the bishop can drop back to G7, and then you're going to have very nice positional exchange sacrifice ideas looming in the air. So this is definitely playable. Now, I should also mention a different idea. If you don't want to give up the bishop pair, this move is excellent. Very good move. And it turns out that white doesn't have a very good way to fight against it. If white plays bishop E2, with the idea to try to trap the bishop. Then after rook c8, you always have very nice bishop idea, bishop going to c2 idea, or even bishop e4 idea to put pressure on the knight. In general, this position is extremely good for black. So I recommend both options, bishop takes f3 or bishop f5, and later on, of course, f6 is the key idea, going for immediate counterplay in the center. So let's get back to the game. So your opponent plays pretty solid move, but kind of harmless move as well. Notice that he made two moves to put the knight on a square where it's really not doing anything. As a matter of fact, in the future, you can always restrict that knight with b6. So it's more of a defensive move. He's just trying to overprotect the pawn. Castles is the right move. Bishop d2, again, kind of useless move, but I guess he's trying to put the bishop on b4. I think black has already equalized. And knight c6 is a very nice move. You put pressure on the pawn, and at the same time, you stop the bishop from coming to b4. Very good idea. h3, bishop takes, queen takes. So yes, you may say white has the advantage of two bishops, but it cost him a lot of time. His knight is awkward, his queen is awkward, whereas black's pieces are optimally placed to hit him with f6, and that's exactly what you played. Excellent move. I really like that idea. Pawn takes, knight takes. You could have also taken with the bishop, but I actually like the idea to try to open up d6 square for the queen. He correctly drops the queen back. It's not recommended to leave the queen opposing the rook, because that sets up a nice knight e4 discovered attacks. So he drops back, and here he offered you a draw, which I think is a little bit premature, but at the same time, white is not better. So objectively, the position is equal. But let me just show you what could happen if the game kind of continues. I think the fact that you took the draw is absolutely fine. You know, you're not better, you're not winning, and neither is white. But if the game continues after queen d6, I can show you how white can get into trouble with obvious moves. First of all, this knight can never move. This is very important to remember. If knight c5, knight takes d4, always drops that pawn. So white typically plays rook e1. This is your only weakness. And you can say that e6 versus d4, they kind of the same, but I feel like it's easier for you to protect e6 rather than for him to protect the d pawn. Rook a e8, now he can never attack the pawn. Whereas you have another piece, the bishop on g7, that can target the pawn after, for instance, knight d7. And again, if he plays a natural move rook c1, after knight d7, this pawn is always under attack from the bishop and from the knight. So he has to play bishop e3 to protect it. And here, let me show you this very instructive plan for black. b5, again, don't be afraid of weakening the square because the pawn is hanging. And if he plays some neutral move like a3, then you have a powerhouse move, knight b6 exclam. And the knight is going to c4, and guess what? He can't stop it. Once the knight gets to c4, it's basically putting so much pressure on white's position that I think only black can play for a win. White's bishop on e3 is like a big fat pawn. Its only job is to protect. Same problem with this knight. Only job is to protect, whereas black has a bunch of options. I would not be surprised that in the future with the knight on c4, you can play for a5, a4 idea, or even blow open the game at the right moment with e5. Very easy play for black, and the problem is white is really struggling to find counterplay. So I hope you get to enjoy this analysis. Again, excellent play. I think you played a very good game. And keep in mind about this plan, queen d6, knight d7, b5, knight b6, knight c4, which could come in handy in the future. Thank you very much. This was Grandmaster Eugene Perelshteyn for AskAGM.com.